Hello. The third moral theory that we're going to be looking at today is the theory that is outcome based. We're going to be using consequentialism, or later, as it will be reformulated by John Stuart Mill, utilitarianism, as the example of an outcome based model of moral reasoning. In contrast, here we're going to be looking to the outcomes or the effects of an act rather than the kind of character of the person doing them, or even her duty and obligation to fulfill a rule or principle. There is later on, as we'll see, a modern version that comes out of Mill called rule utilitarianism that looks at principles and the effects of the principles that we follow as being our guides. Utilitarianism's been around for a while, but it really is going to develop in the modern epoch, and in particular in Britain, following a couple of theorists, Shaftesbury and Hutcheson, who will develop a sentiment or emotional basis to morality rather than a rational. This will be developed later by the Scottish philosopher David Hume and his critique of taste and morality. And that will lead to Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham is going to be the principal founder of consequentialism, or an outlook based theory. But his godson, John Stuart Mill, is going to be the thinker who we're really going to be focusing on. But let's begin with a few quotes from Bentham to give ourselves an insight into this theory, because I wager that most of you will probably um, uh, immediately identify with utilitarianism in some form or other. And I caution you that that's probably because, and I don't mean to offend anyone here, but you probably haven't thought very deeply about the origins or type of the moral theory that you subscribe to or practice. And because our society tends to be oriented along consequentialist or utilitarian ideas, we gravitate towards that, but it might not be the actual moral theory that best fits you. So keep that in mind. And Bentham was a famous social critic, liberal reformist, very well known for developing theories, the first major theories defending animals, and also advocating for prison reform and legislation. In his works on morality, which are quite extensive, he writes that nature has placed mankind under two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. And he will go on to say that it's from them alone that point to what we ought to do and what we should do. So this outlook is going to be called ethical hedonism, where hedonism is the general theory of philosophy that says one ought to maximize one's pleasures because, well, life is short, as the poets say, gather your rosebuds while you may, that sort of thing. That carpe diem kind of outlook will be developed early in Greek philosophy and then rise again in the modern Enlightenment period that Bentham will be in the sort of the tail end of. And one thing to think about that is that hedonism in its philosophical form isn't just saying eat, drink, and be merry, but to develop a kind of nuanced sense of pleasure, because you want to do is maximize your pleasures, right? And in this way, Bentham is going to provide an outlook. And if we take that claim that, we are mastered by two sovereign masters, as it were, pain and pleasure, we tend to go toward those things that make us feel good or pleasurable and avoid those things that are painful. Uh, he's going to further develop this notion following the orientation of sentiment towards happiness. And so he's going to say that happiness is really the goal. To that end, he's going to say that the greatest happiness of the greatest number is the measure of right and wrong. So happiness then becomes, in some sense, equivalent with the development and accrual of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. So then he's going to say it's quite easy, really. All one has to do is develop a calculus, which is going to be called the philosophic or happiness calculus. And, just sort of draw a calculus and put pleasure on one side and pain on the other, and then tally up the units of pain and pleasure. And if the sum is greater in terms of units of pleasure than pain, then that's the right thing to do. Right. Now, as you can guess, that becomes kind of problematic. That it's going to be hard to sort of say that certain sort of physical or pleasures um, are not worthwhile when they might actually be problematic, and certainly in the social sphere. Um, you develop a nuanced version because you do have to look at a series of uh, criteria on um, pleasure and pain, duration, how long do they last, their purity, are they admixed with pains, are they going to give rise, their fecundity, to other pleasures or pains, and so forth. And if we filter through these criteria, then we'll come out with a qualitatively advanced rather than a quantitatively advanced sense of pleasure. And this is exactly where we bring in John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was the godson of Bentham, as I mentioned. He had quite a childhood. You should take some time out and read a little about what he his very demanding education that produced one of the greatest minds. And Mill will be a reformer, a parliamentarian, among other things. He's going to revolutionize the way we do science and ethics. And his contribution is to argue that, while Bentham's orientation is correct in that we have to maximize our outcomes, he's going to give us a more nuanced sense of what pleasure and happiness is. And so he's going to argue that we ought to develop just those kinds of qualitatively better senses and experiences rather than just the quantitative. So it's not just a matter of accruing as many minor pleasures, but going for more sophisticated ones. So um, intellectual or moral pleasures might be more important than physical pleasures in this outlook. But then what Mill is going to do is agree that you do still have to calculate those. And so Mill is going to argue and put forth what he's going to call this the greatest happiness principle, the GHP, which essentially is to produce as much pleasure minus pain for the greatest number of people. And what this is going to give us is something that he's going to call social utility. So the social utility of an act becomes just when that formula is achieved, or we're producing the highest number of pleasure minus pain for the greatest number of people. Well, so right off the bat, something becomes clear that any act that produces the greatest amount of qualitatively better pleasures is going to be the better act. But we're not saying that everyone has to benefit, right? We're saying that just the majority. And you can clearly see, and there are plenty of examples, certainly in literature, and in the real world, where some people are made to suffer for the benefit of others. And that if that sticks in your moral craw, it's because you probably are not a utilitarian. Second consideration we might think about here when looking at utilitarianism is that utilitarians need to believe and need to hold that no act in and of itself is morally or inherently worthy or good. What makes an act good is the outcomes, i.e., that it produces more pleasure than pain for the majority of people. So, an act like murder or theft or what have you is not inherently immoral. Deontologists and some virtue theorists may disagree with that, right? So that's a really important sticking point. If you find yourself saying or believing or drawing the line in the sand, so to speak, saying there's some things that are just wrong, then you're not a utilitarian. Okay, you're going to be a deontologist or virtue theorist or even a care ethicist, our final theory that we'll look at. But for Mill, he's going to argue that, well, nobody would really do those sorts of things for social reasons, right? It's a little more nuanced, but for our purposes, we're just going to think about maximizing. In order to get a handle on this notion of qualitatively better pleasures, what he's going to do is introduce a couple of important quotes. The first is that one human would rather be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And why? Well, because pigs set their pleasure standard pretty low. You'd rather raise the bar and fail than just grab the low hanging fruit, to use a bunch of mixed metaphors here. Well, is going to go on to add that you'd even rather be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool is satisfied, right? So it seems then that there is a pedigree or hierarchy of the kinds of ways that we might experience pleasure that make them more worthwhile than others. All right. So if we think about this in terms of healthcare, we're thinking about sort of maximizing these qualitative pleasures for the greatest number of people. Now, what would a modern healthcare worker, a physician, a nurse, a doctor, a sports medicine practitioner, a nutritionist look like in as a utilitarian? Well, they would believe that no act is sort of wrong, that what makes an act wrong or right is going to be whether it solves the particular problem and brings pleasure, alleviates pain, and so forth, right? They would follow their institutional practices and so forth. They would develop programs and policies that would maximize the amount of positive outcomes for their clinic or their patients, right? Even if there are going to be detrimental effects to some. All right. And so this certainly seems a very modern way of looking at it. And of course, this gives us the concept of triage, right, where we uh, rank cases according to their severity, depending upon how we might be able to apportion our human and material resources and to maximize the outcomes, right? And that's a utilitarian principle through and through. Now, as I said, deriving from Mill and used by later modern uh, utilitarians, you'll see this two very important versions of utilitarianism. One is called act utilitarianism, and the other is called rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is where we will use the same principle of maximizing the outcomes. We're going to do it on an act by act, case by case situation, right? So we're going to treat each patient differently, trying to maximize the outcomes for each patient. A far more widely practiced version is what we call rule utilitarianism. Here, rule utilitarianism, in contrast to act utilitarianism, stipulates a rule or policy that covers all acts that we're going to be dealing with, or all cases. So you can imagine a clinic putting forth a particular practice where you um, do a particular procedure that maximizes the patients that you see, even if it's not the very best thing for a particular case, right? Because maybe a particular treatment might be the very best thing for that particular patient given their conditions, but it would be too costly or too demanding or so forth, right? Okay, so in that sense, now you see what utilitarianism is. Consequentialism will sort of stipulate, comes from Bentham, and to make the distinction meaningful, utilitarianism is the work of John Stuart Mill, right? So that's an outcome-based approach. Again, to test to see whether or not you are utilitarian, again, ask yourself, do you believe that some things are just immoral, innately wrong, right? And if your answer is yes, then you probably should forego this particular moral theory and go back and look more closely at the deontological or the virtue-based theories. Okay, so that's utilitarianism, and we will be turning to our final theory called care ethics in our next discussion. Take care.